Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Hi, I'm Eliana Johnson, flying solo this week without Chris Steyerwalt. Welcome to Ink Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And joining me this week, once again, we are grateful to have the great, wonderful Christine Rosen of the American Enterprise Institute and the Commentary Magazine podcast, as well as the print magazine. Christine, you are media columnist, right?
I am,
Commentary?
technically.
Okay.
Yes.
So, perfect fit for our podcast. And I figured, Christine, we would start this week with Kamala's media tour. We are recording on Thursday morning. So last night she did an hour and 15-minute town hall with CNN's Anderson Cooper moderated it. It was in the key swing state of Pennsylvania, and they took questions from the audience. And I was amused by the questioners. They had a self-described registered Republican and student at Bryn Mawr College. So I didn't actually think that registered Republicans attended Bryn Mawr College, but there you have it. And then they had the undecided Swarthmore College professor, once again, who looked like, if you looked up, what a Bernie Sanders voter would look like in the dictionary, she looked like that. But I actually thought it was a good event and pretty revealing, and that Anderson Cooper's questions were quite good. Among other things, interviews are not her forte, I would say. Town halls are not her forte. She's clearly doing these things to shake things up in the last 2 weeks of the race, because it's my understanding that the Obama faction of the Harris campaign perceives that she's losing, and they want to put her out there to try to change the dynamics of this race. So I want to play a couple of clips and then let's talk about them. First, she's asked, what is a mistake you've made that you regret, and to reflect on that. And then she's asked, what's your biggest weakness, which is like a classic question that candidates are asked in interviews and debates. So let's listen to that.
Is there something you can point to in your life, political life, or in your life in the last 4 years that you think is a mistake that you have learned from?
I mean, I've made many mistakes, and they range from, if you've ever parented a child, you make lots of mistakes too. In my role as vice president, I mean, I've probably worked very hard at making sure that I am well versed on issues, and I think that is very important. It's a mistake not to be well versed on an issue and feel compelled to answer a question.
So, not a mistake she's made per se, but
it could have happened
others
to someone.
might make. Yeah. Christine, what were your thoughts on the town hall?
So I feel like I agree with you. I think Anderson Cooper did a very good job at being very neutral, asking these questions, occasionally following up. I liked that the questions came from seemingly not canned, pre-prepared responses, as many of her other events like this have seemed. It had a less Potemkin village feel than some of her other gatherings with supposed voters. And she was truly revealing of her vacuousness and her inability to answer obvious questions. I mean, the question, what are your weaknesses, is what any of us in our first job interviews were asked. I was asked that when I applied for my job at the movie theater in high school. And to do the sort of answer of, I work too hard or I think too much is sort of preposterous. It was actually a softball question for her. She could have then distinguished herself in a subtle way from the Biden administration's failure. She could have said, I was given charge of all these border issues. It's a huge challenge. I learned this, I learned that. I would do this differently. She could have done that about the transgender surgery in federal prison. She could have said, I don't agree with this. I have a lot of concern for our transgender Americans, but I don't think taxpayer money should be used for this, this, or this. There were a million answers she could have given. What she showed us is what she is, which is someone who is unable to give a pointed, legitimate response to an open-ended question that allows her to do anything other than create a word salad. And it's revealing. I think the Obama people who put her out there are making a mistake. And I don't think we're going to see her out there after her big rally on the mall, National Mall, on Tuesday of next week.
Her answers to some of these questions, in the series of this question was, what's your biggest weakness? And then Anderson Cooper followed up with, what's a mistake you've made that you regret? And you're right. She could have said, I was charged with bringing order to the southern border, and I regret that we didn't do better. We didn't accomplish more. It actually made me wonder, what is she like to be with in person? Is there a person behind this? Because she presents as such a vacuous non-person. Like, she really presents like there's no human being in there. And I think, we're going to get to this later, but the Atlantic and the New York Times had these quote unquote bombshell stories about how Trump is terrible. And he said he wants generals like Hitler and all this and that. The American people have a very good idea of who Donald Trump is. And because of the way she answers questions like this, people are struggling to figure out who Kamala Harris is.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. And the little throwaway line about raising children struck me because she has tried at points in her political life to invoke, being called Mamala by her stepchildren. And look, raising stepchildren is being a parent. But her youngest stepchild was 15 when she married Ella's father, Doug Emhoff. So she has raised a teenager or helped raise a teenager, but she actually isn't, when we think of step-parents who, for example, have raised children who are quite young all the way through their childhood into young adulthood, she hasn't had that experience. And she does seem to struggle with this sense of wanting to be seen as having some of those skills too. Maybe that's empathy, maybe that's, connecting with voters. But it all comes across as awkward. I mean, I wish she would just stop trying to pretend to be what she thinks people want her to be and just be who she is. And that is, I think you're absolutely right. It's not clear what she is, or the other theory is that she knows who she is, but she also understands that what she believes is far to the left of what the average American wants for this country, thinks is necessary for this country, and she can't run on her record as vice president. So she is sort of stuck just coming back to those same 4 or 5 talking points to rambling about, how she has to really buckle down on an issue. We do know, though, that, she's had extremely high turnover among her staff, both when she was a senator, when she was vice president. And that does speak to her ability to lead even a small group, right? If 90% of your staffers leave over the course of their tenure in your office, that's a pretty telling anecdote, a little bit of evidence as to maybe the problem isn't the staffers.
This brings us to Harris's 20-minute interview the previous evening, so Tuesday evening, with MSNBC's Hallie Jackson, that I also thought was pretty well done.
She did great. Yeah.
Yeah,
Jackson.
we should talk. So before I get to this, because the points are interrelated, I wanted to play a clip of Dana Bash's comments after the town hall, because I have a sense, Christine, that some in the mainstream media are starting to turn on Harris. There was such a honeymoon, but the CNN commentary after this town hall was pretty negative. And so let's play this clip from Dana Bash.
I'll just tell you what I'm hearing from people who I have been talking to, and that is that if her goal was to close the deal, they're not sure she did that. And, some people have asked, is she being held to a different standard? Maybe, but that's maybe the world that she's living in. And on the question of who she is, people are understanding that a little bit more. But what she will do, the question about her legislative priorities, name one, there wasn't one. Some more of her personality and her sort of character questions about your weaknesses or what mistakes did you make, not necessarily the answers there.
Christine, hearing that is interesting because her ability to do interviews and answer these questions is not worse. That she hasn't gotten worse since she became the nominee in late July, but it does seem like, and I think it's partly their panic, realization that she's not performing the way she needs to be, and they're expressing their displeasure with that. But what do you make of those comments?
Well, the joy is gone. The Vibes campaign had an expiration date, and I think a lot of the mainstream media folks are recognizing that. The charitable explanation is that they thought she might grow into the role of being comfortable talking to voters and talking to the media, and hiding her from them for a while, a sin for a candidate for which they forgave her. Maybe that's come home to roost, because if she'd had some of these bungling interviews early on, coming right out of the convention when everybody was very happy with her, they might have been smoothed over by the media that clearly is sort of on her side in terms of who they want to win this election. But she disappeared for a while, and then when she comes out, she supposedly prepared. So before this town hall, she spent the whole day preparing. Before the interview with MSNBC, she spent most of that day preparing. She needs a lot of preparation, and then when she comes out, this is what we get. And I was struck, particularly in the MSNBC interview, and Hallie Jackson did a wonderful job, respectful, very calm, followed up when necessary, even kind of mirrored her in wearing, like a tasteful pantsuit, and it was all done perfectly. And yet Harris was not able to respond in coherent ways. And the question that I think really tripped her up, and that seemed, if you looked at her micro expressions on the camera, caught her, was when she was asked what she knew about Joe Biden's
That's
mental
the one
decline.
I was just going to talk about. We should play that exchange. Let's play it.
You have made it clear that you believe this is a binary choice between you and Donald Trump. Those are the candidates on the ballot.
There's only
of course.
two choices.
Yes. And I know that Joe Biden is not on the ballot. I understand that. But the reason that you are at the top of the ticket is because he dropped out of this race. And so I want to ask you, and it was largely because of that debate performance back in June. You defended him in the days before and in the days after as you were campaigning for another 4 years for President Biden. Can you say that you were honest with the American people about what you saw in those moments with President Biden as you were with him again and again, repeatedly in that time?
Of course. Joe Biden is an extremely accomplished, experienced, and capable in every way that anyone would want if they're president.
And you never saw anything like what happened at the debate night behind closed doors with him?
It was a bad debate. People have bad debates. He is absolutely.
But that's the reason why you're here, and he's not running for the top of the ticket.
Well, you'd have to ask him if that's the only reason why.
What do you think?
I am running for president of the United States. Joe Biden is not. And my presidency will be about bringing a new generation of leadership to America that is focused on the work that we need to do to invest in the ambitions and aspirations of the American people.
So this, for me, is a moment. First of all, she has been asked about this here and there. It's something she needs to have a very consistent response to. It worries a lot of voters. And the follow-up was what I loved. Okay, so why are you on the ticket if he's fine? We do know Harris has been constantly defending Biden's cognitive ability, his ability to do the job, all while the American people have watched him deteriorate in real time for the last several years. If she has no response to that, that is a growing doubt in a lot of voters' minds about whether she's honest about other things. Now, is she going to trash her boss on TV? Of course not. And vice presidents sort of generally do tend to not want to criticize the president in their discussions. That's fine. But what she could say is, for the good of the country, Joe Biden recognized that he might not have quite the level of energy necessary. There are a million scripted answers that probably a lot of her staffers have given her. She just is unable to do it. And in a weird way, perhaps it's because she can't be dishonest on that. She has had to have seen that he is unable to perform this role. And we know she is constitutionally responsible for doing something about that fact, and she didn't do it. So I wonder if there's not to get sort of Freudian and not analyzing her motives, but she should have an easy response to this. She should repeat it over and over. She should get this issue off the table. But it keeps coming up and bedeviling her campaign because she can't say it. She can't answer the question. She hasn't answered the question.
Well, what amazed me about this was twofold. So Jackson asks her, Can you say that you were honest with the American people about what you saw in those moments with President Biden as you were with him again and again, repeatedly in that time? And when she says, of course, she seems almost offended by the question, as if it's a ridiculous question to be asking. Meanwhile, Bob Woodward, who has a new book out, the foreword of which basically says Biden is the greatest president of the 21st century, has documented all these people remarking on his decline in 2022, 2023, and
Yes.
that was all over the cable news networks for the past 2 days. You know, before the town hall yesterday, I see Jake Tapper reading quotes from Democratic donors who saw him in very small groups and said he couldn't finish a sentence. And so, we're at the point where even Biden's biggest fans are quoted on the record in books by this renowned Washington Post journalist, and she's behaving in a way like she's acting offended that the question is asked.
Yes, that's very bad for her because, again, she could have even seized on the fact that this has been making the rounds of the news cycle and said, I know everybody's been talking about this book and some donor said this and some donor said that. But, we all have, a day when we're tired, or maybe he was coming back from a trip. I mean, she could have covered for him, or she could have said, that's just wrong. That is not the Joe Biden I know. The Joe Biden I know is X, Y, and Z. The fact that she can't do that basic thing, which is cover for her boss or explain her boss to a public that can, with their own eyes, see what is in front of them. And particularly most recently where, he's running his mouth off saying things like, we got to lock him up about Trump. So he's a little bit of a loose cannon for her campaign. And so I wonder if that also is why she hedges on being directly or indirectly critical or honest about his condition.
The other thing that amuses me is her line, but the line of several Democrats right after the debate, but before they turned on Biden and decided to throw him overboard was, it was a bad debate. Everybody has a bad debate. Right. They're like comparing his performance in June to like Barack Obama's first debate against Mitt Romney, as if the two things are comparable. And it's like one led to the guy dropping off the ticket. It was the worst debate performance in the history of the Republic.
Yes.
And the other one was a bad debate.
Right.
The other one was like rusty hinges of an incumbent.
Well, and there is this sense, and again, this is where her inauthenticity is a real problem and her inability to connect. The rest of the world after that debate, even staunch Democrats, it was that moment in The Wizard of Oz where Toto rips the curtain aside and there's this guy standing there operating all the machinery. Everybody saw Joe Biden for where he was in that moment. And everyone understood that there was no way for him his condition was not going to improve. It would likely get worse. That they're pretending, the pretense, I think, is what is offensive to a lot of regular voters. Like, especially from a party that, constantly harps on Ronald Reagan's, early stage dementia when he was in his second term and is calling Trump crazy and too old and whatnot. So it's the hypocrisy that I think, and the being lied to, which the public really has doubts about. And because you combine that with her inability to answer specific basic policy questions that are posed to her by a friendly media over and over again, that's where the doubt, the uncertainty, the anxiety about whether she can actually perform this job is coming from.
Well, let's talk about Trump's trip to McDonald's on Sunday. The former president, he served fries and stuck his head out the drive-through window at a Philadelphia area McDonald's on Sunday. And his trip there was downstream of a Free Beacon report published in late August that raised questions about Harris's claim to have worked at McDonald's and noted the campaign's shifting narrative about this job. The campaign initially said that she worked at McDonald's to pay her way through school, and then said, oh, actually, she worked there for a summer for extra spending money. And they have since been totally unwilling to provide any further detail about this. So Trump has seized on this and said, she's a liar. She never worked there, and been sort of gleeful about this. And in that culminated in his visit on Sunday, putting on a red apron, dishing out fries. And it was like a total media spectacle. produced some incredible and unforgettable images in my view. What did you make of it, Christine?
Well, first of all, I think the Free Beacon and you in particular need to take a sort of victory lap because you got a presidential candidate to go to a McDonald's. That was entirely because of the story that the Free Beacon published that mainstream media wouldn't touch. And then the follow-up, too, about the fact that the person who supposedly verified hearing this story from Kamala's mother, it's like playing a game of telephone with that campaign. That person's actually, absolute Kamala supporter who's been at rallies, who's been on the been out there stumping with her. So the whole thing is obviously difficult. And most people who then you can go to Social Security website, plug in your Social Security number and see all of your jobs linked to your Social Security card. So the idea that she can't verify this is ridiculous. So good for the Free Beacon for breaking those stories that the mainstream media still won't touch. For Trump, he obviously is known as a McDonald's enthusiast. He's given out McDonald's when he was president at the White House. He eats it himself. He's photographed eating it. But what I thought he did that was very clever in this regard, and he does this well, he doesn't, and this speaks to his authenticity versus her inauthenticity. And I am not a Trump fan, as many of your listeners know. He was Trump. He had his suit on. He took off his coat, threw on an apron they gave him. He took instruction from the guy who was telling him how to work the fryer. He didn't pretend to be competent at it. He didn't pretend he wasn't doing a political photo op. He was just in it, and he was joking around and talking to people and having fun and throwing salt over his shoulder and just doing Trump. This is like Trump in every cameo of every movie he ever appeared in throughout the 80s and 90s. Like this is Trump. He loves it, though. You can tell he's enjoying it. Now, he always enjoys being the center of attention, so that's not a surprise. But what that reads to people watching it is he is not condescending to these folks. He is there. He's not pretending to be something he's not. He's appreciating trying to learn this skill. He's making a kind of political point with a sharp edge directed directly at his opponent. And it worked. And this drove the media absolutely bonkers. They just tried to find a million ways to make this a negative story for him. And in doing that, kind of further endorsed his correct instincts to go in there and do this photo op.
He really seemed to be having a good time.
He did.
But I do think part of that was driving the media crazy.
Oh, completely. Yes.
Where they're all there having to cover what he's doing. And he genuinely seemed to enjoy the interactions that he was having there. When he was serving people in the drive-through, every person who came through, he's like, oh, what a good-looking family. Oh, wow, what an attractive woman. It was like totally Trump in a hilarious way. And Christine, I about died when I saw the New York Times had a story up before his visit. And I about died when I saw this. So their story was, this is the lead. Birtherism meet Burgerism. Vice President Kamala Harris has recalled her stint at a Bay Area McDonald's 41 years ago and introducing herself to voters, a biographical detail relatable to millions of Americans who have toiled in fast food restaurants. But former President Donald J. Trump has repeatedly accused her of inventing it. Lacking a shred of proof, he is charged that she never actually worked under the Golden Arches, recalling his earlier false claim that President Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Mr. Trump's latest allegation also appears to be false. Now, the subheadline of the story is, Donald Trump has claimed without evidence that Ms. Harris never worked at the fast food chain. Her campaign and a friend say she did.
Say she did. Wait, the evidence could be provided by her campaign.
Of course.
And the funny thing is, again, they're shooting themselves in the foot because the Obama birth certificate stuff was bonkers. And that was bad. I didn't like it when Trump did it that time. But to remind people of that, thinking that it's going to make Trump look bad now, when in fact, in that case, he did produce a birth certificate.
He did.
Here it is. So where's now it's basically teeing up the question of, well, then why doesn't her campaign prove it?
So they say Trump has been fact checked because her campaign says, and her friend says, and then if you read in the article, it's the friend whose name is Wanda Kagan. Says that Harris's late mother, she remembers Harris's late mother telling her that Harris had this job.
Yes.
So we start looking up this friend, and the friend is like a Kamala Stan, who is on the campaign trail with her and in the White House with her and hosting Survivors for Harris events. And it turns out that this is the friend who confided in Harris when they were in high school that she was being sexually abused by her stepfather. And Harris invited her to live with their family. And Harris says, that's when I realized she traces her career in law fighting, child sex crimes back to this moment. So it turns out that this friend who's attesting to this, the narrative has become a part of the Harris campaign. The friend has been a surrogate for the campaign and is all over the campaign trail with Harris, which, okay.
Right.
However, the Times doesn't disclose any of that to its readers.
Right.
They don't say that. And so anyhow, we now have one living person who has heard secondhand that Harris had this job.
Who is in the tank for the Harris
Yes,
campaign
exactly.
anyway. I mean, I think all of us who've had minimum wage jobs, I've had many, I could still find a high school friend who could attest to the media that I indeed served popcorn poorly at an AMC movie theater in Florida. So this idea, again, it speaks to inauthenticity. It's not enough for maybe for another candidate, it would be enough to have the friend who's part of the campaign say, oh, no, I can totally vouch for her. Somehow that doesn't work with Harris because of her other authenticity problems and voters' doubts about her competence and her truthfulness on a number of other issues. So again, it seems like a small thing, but for a campaign that's been trying to run on vibes this entire summer and fall, I think it does matter because the vibe has definitely shifted, and not just because of the French fry story.
I would also say I think the vibe of the news coverage we're getting has shifted. Like this Times story was crazy and angry and ridiculous. And I think they're upset and panicking that they don't think she has this in the bag. Like comparing Trump's campaign trail barbs about her summer job at McDonald's to birtherism is laughable.
Yes.
And the tendentiousness of this article was laughable. And it reads as desperate and ridiculous.
Right.
And by the way, I did write the reporter on the article and say, did you not think it relevant to disclose to your readers that the campaign story about the length and, reasons that she had this job had changed? And did you not think it relevant to disclose to your readers that the friend is a campaign surrogate? And, no reply. Not that they owe me a reply, but it is interesting.
Well, and I still have so many questions that, again, Kamala Harris herself or her campaign could answer about what it was. She spent a lot of time in Canada. She had some formative years in Canada. What was that like? She likes to say, I was, raised in a middle-class household. Well, middle class where? And, she has two academic parents with PhDs. That's not generally what one would think of when one thinks of a middle-class household in America. And again, these are minor questions I have, and I could look into them myself, whatnot. But the whole point of being a candidate, especially one who was sort of forced in front of everybody as they pushed the incumbent aside and had just a few months to define herself, is that you have to define yourself. And she has failed to do that. I think that's ultimately what the panic in her campaign and the slightly tougher media coverage in the last week or so is suggesting. Who are you? That's the question the American voter still doesn't know about Kamala Harris.
The Canada stuff is really interesting because she went to high school in Canada and then did a year of junior college there, which I believe is their equivalent of 12th grade. But in order to go to four-year college in the States, you have to do that. And then she came to Howard in the States. And I think that's been intentionally obscured,
downplayed,
ignored, downplayed by the campaign because they don't, in the same way that John McCain was not born in the contiguous United States and Ted Cruz is Canadian, that sort of stuff can be problematic for candidates. But I think that's why we haven't heard more about it. But it is interesting because those are, of course, formative years for a person.
And when we all make our most embarrassing mistakes often, let's just say, just
well,
for
hers
instance,
was just, studying too hard and caring too much.
She cared too much.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the big Jeffrey Goldberg article in The Atlantic that has two components to it. The first, apparently, was Trump telling a fallen Army private's family that he would pay for her funeral. And then allegedly, when the bill came for $60,000, saying, no way, I'm not paying for this. I'm just going to read from the article. Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a effing Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order. Don't pay for it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Can you believe it? He said, according to a witness, effing people trying to rip me off. So that's the first part of the story, that he was a total jerk to this family of a fallen Army private, a young woman, 20-year-old young woman. The second is that he praised Hitler's generals and said he really wanted generals who were as wonderful as Hitler's generals, which is not a new story. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser reported in their book, The Divider, Trump in the White House, that Trump had asked John Kelly, who was his then chief of staff, why can't you be more like the German generals? By which I guess he means loyal.
Right.
And so the Atlantic article we got early in the day, I believe Tuesday, and then later in the day came the New York Times article in which John Kelly is on the record with New York Times reporter Michael Schmidt, saying, it says he sat for 3 recorded interviews. With Election Day looming, Mr. Kelly, deeply bothered by Mr. Trump's recent comments about employing the military against his domestic opponent, agreed to 3 on-the-record recorded discussions with a reporter for the New York Times about the former president, providing some of his most wide-ranging comments yet about Mr. Trump's fitness and character. And he says, Trump's unfit, he's terrible, he's very bad character, and so on and so forth. What do you make of it, Christine?
Well, the 2 things. Look, John Kelly was fired by Trump. He's perfectly within his rights to tell the American people what he saw, what he thinks of Trump, that he doesn't think he's fit for office. It's a free country that you're allowed to do that. And I think people should consider what he said, because he did work as chief of staff. He saw a lot day to day. He obviously has come away from that experience with a very negative impression of Trump's character. But we knew that. This is not news. This is something that the American people have been hearing from lots of people who worked for Trump, or many of whom Trump later fired. Including the Hitler's generals remarks, which suggest Donald Trump should also read history books, since Hitler's generals tried to assassinate Hitler. So this is probably not the example that he thought it was. To the earlier story, though, the first part of the Atlantic story about the soldier and the soldier's funeral, I think this was an egregious error that the Atlantic will, and so far has refused to correct. And that's that they are just making stuff up at this point in service of an ideological goal, which they have shown in the last few months in particular they want to achieve, and which their owner, Laurene Powell Jobs, clearly wants. She's a very close friend and supporter.
Intimate of
a
Harris.
Very good friend and a huge financial supporter of the Harris campaign, which is a Harris victory. So they are trying to pull out all the stops for that. But this story was instantly refuted, not just by the sister of the woman who died, who went to social media and said, this isn't true, and I just voted for Trump, but also by other people who were in the room for that meeting, and people who had given interviews with The Atlantic for the piece, who said that their words were deliberately misconstrued in order to fit the narrative that The Atlantic wanted to promote for that part of their story. So that's a huge journalistic no-no. It's not the first time that Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic has made claims using all of his anonymous sources, which he can't back up with any sort of evidence beyond trust me, which I think a lot of readers no longer do when it comes to the political reporting of The Atlantic, which is a shame because there's still good journalists working at that magazine. But I think when it comes to Donald Trump, trust but verify should be any reader's goal. So I think in some ways that kind of blew up on the tarmac for them a little bit. And the Hitler point, which is obviously what the Harris campaign has decided is going to be in the final weeks of this campaign, her doubling down strategy. Joy is gone, Hitler is in, and she's going to run with that because they've decided fear and anger are going to be the emotions that bring those voters that she still needs to the polls. We'll see if that works. I think this avoids the much more interesting, and I think for voters, more important discussion of temperamentally who of our two choices here is better suited to lead the country. I probably disagree with Harris on almost every policy. Temperamentally, she is probably better suited because she isn't volatile. She's kind of an empty suit, but is that safer for the country? Is the void safer than the vortex of chaos that we know Donald Trump tends to bring in with him? Those are our choices. They're both terrible choices. I wish they could both lose. But in that sense, the reporting that a magazine like The Atlantic and a newspaper like The Times, which have this, vast resources and excellent reporters at their disposal should be doing, is looking at the questions that way. What they're doing instead is something different. They're pursuing a partisan project here, which is now at this point, thanks to the many alternative venues for reporting that voters have and can find themselves, starts to look a little bit obvious in these final weeks of the election.
I had a couple thoughts about these. First, on the Atlantic, I think if one is going to report a story, and I think what happened here is indicative of a lot of what I saw covering the Trump White House, which is that reporters feel a lot more liberty and room to move when reporting on Trump than they would covering anybody else, including other Republicans, but especially Democrats, because the view is he lies, his people lie, and it doesn't matter if they deny things on the record, like we're going ahead anyway. And that you can screw up and be wrong, and your peers in the press will not hold you accountable. It won't be embarrassing because you erred in the right direction. So they can print this and be wrong and be reprimanded by the soldier's family, and they will not pay a price with their peers, which is the only people whose respect and adulation they care about. Beyond that, if this had been about a different subject matter, like, of course, the family, the surviving family members of this Army private would have been checked with. Of course, the on-the-record denials would have been printed. Now, they may still have gone to print with it, but there would have been a lot more explanation in the piece of why they decided to do so and what the considerations were, in my view. But I think it's actually highly unlikely that would have happened, given all of the on-the-record denials. And it's far more likely that simply the family's wishes would have prevailed.
Well, it's interesting that because the mainstream media has just over and over again for the last 12 years now insisted that Trump and Republicans in general are always undermining, institutions and undermining the rules and not playing by the rules. And yet in their own journalism, I think you're right. There's always been a kind of get out of jail free card for reporters who also don't follow the rules when it comes to covering Trump, because Trump.
Yeah, I mean, look, the best example of this is the reporting on the 51 national security officials who told us the Hunter Biden laptop is disinformation, and there just nobody paid a price for any of that. But my other thought is actually, I think, more pertinent to like the impact of all of this. There was talk about, is this an October surprise, and this, that, and the other, and reading these pieces, it just all felt like such a retread to me. And it did underscore to me like that there's just nothing about Trump that I think we're going to learn. And I was sort of spitballing with somebody like, what could we actually learn about him that would move anybody? It just felt stale to me, because it's not surprising that he would praise Hitler's generals. It's not surprising. We know John Kelly hates him. We know what John Kelly's concerns are. He's the most scrutinized, the most covered, the most reported on, the most backstabbing and the most backstabbed, figure in modern history, probably. And I do think the elite media maybe has a view that like there are undecided voters who are going to learn these facts and their votes are going to hinge on this. But I just do think it's far more likely that the votes are going to hinge on what we talked about first, which is Harris's ability, or the lack thereof, to paint a picture of herself as a person and herself as a policy person.
Well, and look, what there's one thing Trump could do that would turn the American public against him completely, and that's like, beat up a puppy. Like if he harmed a pet, I think that would be
Well,
that
I
would
said
turn the tide.
if he were diddling a little kid and that came out,
Yes,
it's like,
yes.
live
Those two
live
things.
girls and dead boys. Like I'm
Right.
not even sure about, or sorry, dead girls and live boys.
Right.
I'm
right.
not even sure about the dead girls part, but the live boys I think could be pretty damaging.
Yes.
This will come back to haunt me. This, saying this, but none of this stuff I think is going to move people. It's basically all known.
Mhm. No,
It's
that's
just
right.
not. And by the way, these stories gave me such bad flashbacks to the Trump era.
Yes. Yes.
I was like, oh God,
Well, here's
I'm
the
done
here's
with this.
but they're also look, if they're thinking ahead and they're at all wondering what the world will look like in a few weeks if Trump wins again, they're also setting up, I think, something that could be called similar to the crisis they think Trump will enact, which is a legitimacy crisis. If, as Kamala Harris says, and she said it at the town hall again last night, if she truly believes that Donald Trump is a fascist, she is required by the Constitution to certify the results of the upcoming election. Will she do that? Why won't anyone ask her that question? Because if you truly believe Donald Trump is Hitler, how could you certify him having control over the country for another 4 years? And I wonder if a lot of this is maybe table setting for the left to be able to really challenge the results of this election if it goes to Trump in the same way that Trump has done this as well. He did it in 2020, and I think it was an egregious effort to undermine the way our system allows for the peaceful transfer of power, obviously ending in the horror of January 6th. So it's if they're going to do that, they are setting themselves up for a very strange thing, either revealing that this was all hyperbole meant to win an election at any cost, which is what I actually hope it is. Because if they truly believe he's a fascist, they cannot allow him to hold power. And so what happens then with our system of government? And how does the media enable that sort of rhetoric on the one side while constantly condemning it when it's used by Donald Trump and his allies?
Let's talk a little bit about 60 Minutes. The show has been under fire for putting out 2 different clips of Kamala Harris, and they are answers to it makes it look like it is 2 different answers to the same question. So one was a sort of teaser clip that aired on CBS's Sunday show ahead of the interview, and the second was the answer that aired in the actual interview. And the answer that aired in the interview itself, which had a far larger audience, was a better answer. And so the Trump campaign, but among many others, assailed 60 Minutes and began pressing the network to provide a transcript so that we could see for ourselves what her full answer was, or if that the network had taken an answer from a different question and subbed it into her answer for this question in order to make her look better. But there was a press for transparency. And CBS issued a statement that said the following, and this is from Monday. Former President Donald Trump is accusing 60 Minutes of deceitful editing of our October 7th interview with Vice President Kamala Harris. That is false. 60 Minutes gave an excerpt of our interview to Face the Nation that used a longer section of her answer than that on 60 Minutes. Same question, same answer, but a different portion of the response. When we edit any interview, whether a politician, an athlete, or movie star, we strive to be clear, accurate, and on point. The portion of her answer on 60 Minutes was more succinct, which allows time for other subjects in a wide-ranging 21-minute-long segment. Remember, Mr. Trump pulled out of his interview with 60 Minutes and the vice president participated. Our long-standing invitation to former President Trump remains open. If he would like to discuss the issues facing the nation and the Harris interview, we would be happy to have him on 60 Minutes. Okay, Christine, your take.
It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I assume it was drafted by a combination of lawyers and their PR department, but I think their big mistake was scolding Trump for not appearing. Because why would a Republican appear on a show that's clearly favorably editing the response of Democratic politicians' interviews in ways that are beneficial to them? What do you think they would do with a Republican? So I think his healthy suspicion not to appear on that show is fine. And he's been giving tons of other interviews, so it's not as if he's avoiding the media entirely. two things about Harris's interview. She had given very few serious sit-down interviews up to this point by herself, right? Just what, one, maybe two? So this was the stakes for her in this interview were quite high. What we have seen since that interview and since the selective editing, the reason people mistrusted, and it's not just media, critics like us or Republicans. It's the viewing public who starts to wonder about this, and their expectations of transparency are high these days because we have more transparency thanks to alternative media, thanks to social media, thanks to all these ways and tools in which we can follow up on stories, and a narrative constructed in one area cannot necessarily hold if the facts start to chip away at it. So in this sense, they should have just released the transcript and been like, you know what, here you go. You guys are nuts. Very few people would have gone through and parsed it. Maybe it would have been a 24-hour news story, largely on conservative media, and then it would have disappeared. But they doubled down. And they doubled down, I think, for the same reason that there was doubling down when the transcript of Joe Biden's interview about his son, that was about the papers that he had, the classified documents interview, which was not released because, he would sound as he is, which is not entirely cognitively there. So they are not going to release Kamala's transcript because they don't want to show everyone just how heavily the editing hand had to be embraced in that interview. Obviously, they interview, and for interviews, they cut for space, they cut for time, they cut for commercial. Everybody knows that. But transcripts can be released pretty easily, and other shows have done it. And the fact that they chose not to, and then her ensuing performances in other interviews, suggests that it was a bit of a disaster for her, and they tried to clean up on aisle 5.
What I thought was so galling about this statement is that CBS made a mistake here, and that it is not typical to show clips of the same question being asked and two different answers. That was
Yes.
obviously somebody made a mistake, and they don't cop to that.
Right.
So they don't say that we're sorry that our editing wasn't consistent across all the platforms or, all the shows on which we aired this, including when we were promoting the interview, and that sowed confusion and distrust. And so they don't cop to any mistake. And then they start pointing the finger at Trump, who did nothing wrong. He doesn't owe them an interview. And so I just thought it was galling for them to, they say former President Trump's accusing us. Well, a lot of other people are also accusing them. A lot of other people in their viewing audience, which is large, had questions about what happened. And then they close by saying, remember, Mr. Trump pulled out of his interview with 60 Minutes and the vice president participated.
Right.
It's just...
They should have just said Team Harris.
Right. Their sense of entitlement is totally galling. And I don't understand. I can't remember where I was saying this, but unless their agreement before sitting down to the interview with Harris was that there would be no transcript release, that's the only explanation I can think of.
Right.
Other than there's some dirty business happening for why they wouldn't just release his transcripts. It really doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's also in the current environment in terms of Americans' mistrust of media in general, which is just plummeting. It's been declining for some time, but now it's precipitously declining. You would think that a major legacy media institution like CBS News would say, you know what? We don't want to look like we're caving to pressure from the Trump campaign here. However, we understand that our viewing public might have legitimate questions. And as you say, they could have solved that by simply acknowledging to this one error, just acknowledging one error and saying we'll do better next time, or even just saying, yeah, next time we'll keep it consistent. But they couldn't bring themselves to do that, and it is going to contribute to their own continued mistrust that I think is legitimate on the part of the American people when they expect a certain level of straightforward back and forth. And the interview itself, he did a great job. The interview itself, I don't have any problems with. I would have liked more follow-up questions, but it was a decent interview. But if after the fact it revealed a candidate who couldn't think quickly on her feet, be nimble about responses, and even come up with a simple policy declaration now and then, and they massaged that to make her look as good as possible, because I don't think she came across that well in the interview overall anyway. If that was the best that they could find from that interview, then we have a legitimate reason to think about what might have ended up on the cutting room floor.
All right, Christine, the last item I wanted to talk about briefly before I shout out my favorite item of the week was noted by one of the ruthless guys, Michael Duncan, on Twitter, there's been an effort by the left over the past 10 years or so, maybe 5 years, to pop up local news sites. And they're all under the banner of Courier Newsroom, but they have different names. The Copper Courier, the Gander Newsroom, and they're local news sites that essentially rewrite press releases for Democrats under the guise of news articles. And then they can be used in political advertisements that cite quote unquote news sources.
Right.
And he noted that the election's largest outside spender on social media isn't a political action committee, it's Courier Newsroom. The constellation of liberal fake news sites funded by the Swiss billionaire Hans-Georg Weiss and other left-wing mega donors, because this is a big effort on the part of left-wing donors. And he concludes that, this is a smart strategy. I've been advocating for conservatives to invest more in media for years, and says politics is downstream of culture, and to shape culture, you have to invest in content people actually want to consume. The left understands this. It's time for the right to wake up. Okay. I think maybe it's a smart strategy to spread this content on social media. What I don't agree with is that this is content people actually consume. If you go to these sites, because it's simply rewritten press releases that are positive stories about Democrats, it's actually not compelling content. So it may be a compelling political strategy to put money on Facebook behind this, but I have not, and the sites have not taken off as news sites in their own right. So I just thought that was an interesting tidbit in the intersection of media and culture, where the people consuming this don't really know what the purpose behind it is.
Yes, and it's also, well, there are two things. There's the irony that the thing that killed genuine, authentic old local news was a left-wing, a guy who's now become quite left-wing in his donations, which is Craig Newmark, Craigslist, which killed the classified ads in local news, which propped up a lot of their business model. And when those collapsed, so did these smaller outlets for print media. But it's also kind of rich that the Democratic Party, which has spent a lot of time lecturing the American people, and particularly people on the right, about the dangers of misinformation and disinformation, have created a model that is nothing but a conduit for that, which then, of course, spreads to social media, the other platforms that they're constantly wanting to regulate and monitor and censor people on if the news is coming from the right side of the aisle. They have created a rather bog of deliberate. I mean, the word propaganda is strong, but the whole point of these outlets is to just churn out pro-democratic
That is the point of
news.
them, which is
Yes.
why it's like, oh, you're not shaping the culture
No.
and producing compelling content. You're producing like ad fodder for Democrats.
Exactly. And
essentially.
look, America has a long history of this. We used to have partisan newspapers on either side all over the country. You'd have political parties that had their own newspapers and they would churn out their own stuff. The difference here is, as you say, there isn't reported content here.
Right.
They're just, and
Exactly.
pretty soon AI, if not already, AI will be generating a lot of this stuff for them. So the question of whether it makes an impact is I think best seen in terms of its cumulative content when you add it to the TikTok content, you add it to all the other ways in which particularly younger voters who get a vast amount of their news from social media platforms, whether that's feeding into a general mindset for them, a worldview that is shaped more by the left or more by the right.
All right, that brings us to reader mail. We have a letter from Marlo Gazzoli, great name, in Wisconsin, who says, "Dear Eliana and Chris, I hope you are well. The fact checkers have saved us once again. In the greatest service since PolitiFact told us that Bill and Hillary were in fact not filmed eating human flesh with Haitian gang leader barbecue. Newsweek informs us Donald Trump has shared what is likely an AI-generated image on his Truth Social account, showing him as a player for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Imagine the confusion that would have gripped the nation were it not for the heroic factinistas." That's great. Oh my gosh, the picture is amazing.
I've seen it. Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Somebody
it is quite
comments,
something.
you sure? I thought Trump played for the Eagles. It was so good.
That's great.
And then I will shout out my favorite item of the week before we go. A wonderful New York Times story that ran yesterday on I believe it's a 9-year-long study that's been going, funded by the National Institute of Health. Yeah, it began in 2015 on the effects of puberty blockers on transgender, well, they're not trans, on gender dysphoric children.
Mm-hmm.
And we learn in this article that the doctor who's running the study has not released the results because she fears political backlash, i.e., it doesn't conform to what transgender activists want to see. It does read like the doctor running the study is one of them. In the Times writes, puberty blockers did not lead to mental health improvements, most likely because children were already doing well when the study began. That's what the doctor says now. However, when the study actually began, she said that a quarter of the children were having, mental health issues and in severe distress. So in the 9 years since the study was funded by the National Institutes of Health and as medical care for this small group of adolescents became a searing issue in American politics, Dr. Olson Kennedy's team has not published the data. Asked why, she said the findings might fuel the kind of political attacks that have led to bans of the youth gender treatments in more than 20 states, one of which will soon be considered by the Supreme Court. I do not want our work to be weaponized, she said. It has to be exactly on point, clear, and concise, and that takes time. Okay. An impressive story by the New York Times.
This is a huge. So if you're following this issue at all, it's astonishing. This is just another point in a much broader turnaround globally, starting in the UK with some reassessment of some of these treatments, and now leading to this case out of Alabama, which the court will hear. This is huge that the New York Times did this report. And if you read the comments, I generally don't encourage people to read comments on stories, but it's useful in this regard to go look at those comments. A lot of the people commenting are saying, this is why I think the Democrats have gone too far on this issue. They are taking away from children the ability to grow into their own bodies. They'll never have the ability to experience sexual pleasure or to have children in many cases. And this has even struck people, left of center, like Andrew Sullivan, who said he's reconsidering his vote for Kamala Harris based on some of the stuff that's coming out about transgender activism. So for the New York Times, the mainstream liberal opinion monger that it is, to allow to publish this story, this is a sea change.